Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our discussion series on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka host a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on the Japanese politics, business insights, and the Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Good evening to everybody who is in the room already. Dr. Stephen Nagy is a Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo. Today's topic is free and open Indo-Pacific and the Belt and Road Initiative, and how China and Japan compete in their visions of regionalism. So, Stephen, let's start.
Thanks, Maya, and thank you to everyone that's joined this evening or this morning, depending on which part of the world you're from. I know there's some people from Vietnam online, which is great. So hello, Xin Chao from Tokyo. I'm glad to hear you. So tonight's theme is looking at the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific through the lens of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision and China's Belt Road Initiative. And I wrote a paper about academic paper about this maybe half a year ago, and it's picked up a lot of momentum for the simple reason is that when we look at these two formulas or these two different kinds of regional visions, they're interacting with each other in a sense that both countries are both proactive and reactive in terms of their foreign policy. I think most of us know that Japan's so-called vision of the Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific, was first articulated by former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo in India. He gave a speech at the Indian Parliament in 2005 talking about the confluence of two seas. And basically he was trying to create a narrative of how the Indian Ocean and India are connected through the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, East China Sea to Japan. And that they need to use this historical context to build a regional framework or regional community that shares similar norms and similar understandings of rule of law, and importantly, start to build institutions that are focused on what's called rules-based behavior. And this is why we think about Japan continues to use this concept of free and open Indo-Pacific vision. Free and open refers to the region being primarily governed by international law through transparent, rules-based understandings of how to behave within the region. And this is really important, of course, when we're thinking about sea lines of communication, those transport arteries for imports and exports and energy resources throughout the region. And I think that's really a good way to kind of understand how Japan has been thinking about this. Now, Japan's vision is not is evolving, and again, so is the Belt Road Initiative. And when we look at the Belt Road Initiative, it really looked at, in many ways, Japan's Indo-Pacific thinking and started to think about how China can reshape the region's regional architecture. And what that means in terms of regional architecture means how the region integrates and becomes more cohesive. And China thought that the Belt Road Initiative, based on 5 land corridors of infrastructure and a maritime corridor, the Maritime Silk Road, that China could reorient the regional economic integration really away from Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia orientation to an orientation which was really from the east to the west, so from China through Southeast Asia and South Asia, South Central Asia, extending to Europe. And I think that what we see is that the Chinese, really in the first Belt Road Forum back in 2017, really articulated this idea of creating a community of common destiny. This is how they articulate their vision based on non-legalistic, non-binding forms of relations. And really the idea was to use China's experience of development, and that was building infrastructure, opening up parts of the economy, being able to move labor into the urban areas, and through that labor could earn capital and bring it back to the villages to help it develop. So China had a vision of exporting this model so that they could open up the economies of Nepal or South Central Asian states or other countries through infrastructure, and that infrastructure would help develop these countries. Now, what's interesting about this, the Belt Road Forum, we see Japan react to the Belt Road Forum and it reacted by doubling down on the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, but bringing in some conditions in terms of how it thinks about infrastructure connectivity, how it thinks about building relations. And those conditions were thinking about environmental sustainability, fiscal sustainability, sustainable kinds of projects, and lastly, focusing on this idea of geopolitically free investments in countries. Now, Japan has always done this, and I think that in many ways they reacted to the BRI by focusing on these and trying to highlight these characteristics of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific initiatives that largely focused on development and infrastructure and connectivity projects. And they didn't do this by themselves. They worked with Australia and India in terms of resilient supply chains. They worked with the United States and Australia and India through what we call the Blue Dot Network, was to try and create a brand in which any new infrastructure connectivity projects would really be based on those four conditions. And what's interesting about this is that we see China adopted many, or if not all, of the same principles at the Second Belt Road Forum in 2019. Which again, I think provides some really interesting evidence that these two initiatives are interacting with each other, and there's potential for these two kinds of initiatives to try and that will continue to influence each other in positive directions to try and get stakeholder buy-in in the region. I'd like to just distinguish between these two initiatives in terms of how I understand them. And again, I think the free and open Indo-Pacific vision that comes out of Japan does have a security component. It's worried about maritime sea lanes. But the real foundation of the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, as I understand it, is really about economic security, about ensuring that Japan is embedded into the Indo-Pacific regional economy, that they're part of the growing group of countries that are involved in making rules and making institutions, and that Japan is, again, wedded to this idea that institutions should be transparent and based on rule of law, and that rule of law should primarily be based on international law. And how Japan is thinking about the free and open Indo-Pacific is that this vision extends from North America, South America, through the Pacific Ocean, through the South China Sea, through the Indian Ocean, both east and west, to the east coast of Africa. And again, it's trying to invest in a region that it understands as institutionally poor, that requires development and infrastructure connectivity, and that from Japan's point of view, this will be the center of the global economy in the decades to come. In contrast, and I think the BRI has some similar components, but again, I would like to contrast this idea of rule of law and transparency to what I understand as the BRI's main differences is that it really focuses on non-binding agreements with partner countries along the BRI, and this is really to protect China's sovereignty, but also to protect the principles of peaceful coexistence that China really, really values. And really this has to do with sovereignty, non-interference, they call it win-win relationships, and other principles that I think are important when we're talking about these two initiatives. So where are they today? And I think this is quite interesting. Let me go back. I think also that the free and open Indo-Pacific vision is largely of course, it's a Japanese vision, but there's many opportunities for multilateral, bilateral, and various formulas of cooperation. So we see, for example, India and Japan cooperating on the Asian-Africa Growth Corridor. We see Australia, Japan, and India focusing on resilient supply chains. We see the United States, Australia, and Japan focusing on infrastructure funding. So there's a lot of different kinds of formulas that are very much related to how they understand the Indo-Pacific vision. Now, in contrast to the BRI, this is primarily a Chinese-driven initiative. It's funded through the AIIB, that's the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is a multilateral or international organization. But again, the BRI is seen as a signature initiative. It's written into the Chinese constitution, and it's attached to the leadership of Xi Jinping. So it is really an initiative that goes beyond the state, and it's tied to an individual. And I think that this will create challenges moving forward. But I want to, again, contrast these two visions in terms of where they're coming from. I would like to also add to there's some really interesting trends, I think, in the COVID-19 pandemic era, which I think is going to make it more difficult for at least the BRI to be sustainable moving forward. But let's first focus on the free and open Indo-Pacific or FOIP vision, how sustainable it is in the COVID period and post-COVID period. Well, again, it's focusing a lot on development and infrastructure connectivity and inculcating Japan into the regional economy. That's really important, and that's something that is fundamentally in the interest of Japan. Japan already has 40 or 50 years track record of engaging in the region through overseas development aid and FDI, foreign direct investment. So it's well placed to continue moving forward. And I think COVID-19 provides the opportunity to reorient some of that aid towards health infrastructure, to deal with some of the informal economic challenges moving forward after the pandemic. So I think that there's some more sustainability moving forward with the Japanese initiative because of the focus, but also because of the multilateral dimension of the free and open Indo-Pacific vision. And I think one other aspect is that we've seen a definite shift from in the United States from the highly securitized Indo-Pacific strategy that the Trump administration advocated to what the Biden administration is doing, is slowly moving towards an understanding that any kind of Indo-Pacific vision moving forward in the region is going to require an economic pillar, a development pillar, and really investing in diplomacy. On the BRI front, my general view about the BRI in terms of sustainability, that I think that its ambition for broader Eurasia, so an initiative that stretches all the way to Europe, will probably need to be scaled back. It'll need to scale back because of the model of the BRI. And the model of the BRI is primarily focused on this idea of exporting capital, exporting labor, and exporting overcapacity to recipient countries. With borders closed, it's very hard to export labor. With borders closed, it's very hard to export goods and capital as well. So I think that it will have to reorient itself during the COVID-19 pandemic. Second, I think it's important for us to think about the long-term downward trend on the Chinese economy in terms of growth, the structural issues associated with its population. We have a growing concert of countries that are increasing pressure on the Chinese economy, which is going to create challenges in terms of the economy growing in the coming years. And of course, during the pandemic period, we see periodic shutdowns of the Chinese economy, which is impacting overall GDP growth per year. So I think that there's going to be a rethink in terms of the BRI, in terms of its overall ambitions, its scope, and its ability to continue its current model of exporting overcapacity labor and resources. And in that sense, both the BRI and the free and open Indo-Pacific vision are going to continue to shape each other. They're in competition, and that competition may turn into hyper competition, but it could turn into opportunities for cooperation. And we've seen some of that in 2019 when former Prime Minister Abe visited Beijing. In October, they signed 55 joint agreements for what we call third country infrastructure cooperation. Now, most of these haven't come to fruition, but the point is both of these nations understand the need for cooperating through infrastructure cooperation through the region, but they don't want to join each other's initiative. Now, Japan understands this cooperation with China as an ability to, or a potential to try and shape Chinese behavior and shape its governance and shape its BRI practices, so they're more in line with global standards. And from the Chinese point of view, cooperation with Japan will allow China to learn some good practices and build some political capital in terms of better branding the BRI moving forward. So there's a lot on the table in thinking about these two initiatives. Moving forward, I think that there's a couple areas that we should be thinking about that may fundamentally reshape these two initiatives. One is the degree of assertive behavior by our Chinese friends within the region. If it intensifies, then I think that there's a possibility that the free and open Indo-Pacific vision could become more securitized and to meet the challenges that at least Japan and other countries face or feel that they may face from an assertive China. A second possibility, of course, is some kind of economic implosion. An economic implosion in Japan or in China would, of course, be a challenge to both of these initiatives in terms of their economic sustainability. And this is a very, very serious and I think a possible issue moving forward. This year, the Chinese economy is really facing significant headwinds. And we've seen this in the real estate business. We've seen it with domestic consumption. We've seen it with inflation. And these pressures are not going away. In the Japanese context, of course, a huge amount of debt has been taken on during the COVID-19 period. They've closed their borders, which means all the capital that was accrued from 20 or 30 million tourists coming into the country every year has affected the the coffers of the Japanese government, and that could create challenges in terms of economic stability moving forward. So what happens in the domestic economies really could create challenges in terms of sustainability. And lastly, I think another red card or a black swan that we should be thinking about is what happens within the region in terms of regional pressure points. And the pressure points that I'm thinking about are probably three. The first one is on the Korean Peninsula. What happens if there's some kind of conflict or friction on the Korean Peninsula? What does that mean for these initiatives moving forward? Will they create a challenge in terms of their sustainability or not? A second area, of course, is Taiwan, and we've talked about Taiwan in the past. And Japan has had increasingly stronger voices in terms of articulating its position that Taiwan is an important part of Japan's security, and that what happens in Taiwan matters for Japan. And that I think any kind of friction or conflict over Taiwan would impact both the BRI and the FOIP vision substantially. More assertive behavior in the South China Sea, gray zone tactics, or potential cascade into some kind of conflict would also, I think, create challenges in terms of the sustainability within these two initiatives. There's, of course, other possibilities in terms of the sustainability of these three initiatives, or these two initiatives. But again, I think I'm just trying to paint a broader picture for today's discussion. So with that, I'm going to stop there and open up the floor to communication and sharing of views with anybody that would like to come up to the call and share their views.
Please raise your hand. Let me bring you up on stage. If you have comments, questions, and if you want to share your views, the discussion is open. And Stephen, you mentioned that, moving forward, there are certain threats to the sustainability of the initiatives here, which you talked about in the beginning. And one of the threats is economic implosion in either Japan or China. But to me, it looks like most of the countries in the region, if not all of them, actually face this challenge. Because especially the countries which are not so, let's say, industrially and economically developed. So I just wonder why, of course, China and Japan are the leaders here in this region, but still, how big is the threat when we think about the other countries? I mean, the same economic implosion of other countries here.
So Maya, that's a great question. So we can say economic implosion or substantial economic slowdown.
Right.
And the reason why I say it matters in the context of Japan and China mostly because they are the funders, they are the lenders, they are the countries that are out there, building the infrastructure and the connectivity projects. They're the ones that are building digital infrastructure. They're the ones that are providing the funds for these. And as a result, if they have less funds, if their economies are stressed, this is going to create challenges in terms of them providing the resources to recipient countries. Now, recipient countries, of course, that's another area. I mentioned three things that could possibly create challenges, but of course, recipient countries are also challenged, whether it's Nepal, whether it's Cambodia, Laos, whether it's other countries. If there is an economic implosion, and in fact, many of these countries have, because of COVID-19, have substantial economic challenges right now. It may create challenges in terms of paying back the loans, or it could create challenges in terms of the terms of loans moving forward. And as a result, they may not actually be in a position to take on these projects because the interest rates may be too onerous to actually pay back. So I think it's really important for us to think about the benefactor side, but also the beneficiary side in terms of these, the BRI and the free and open Indo-Pacific. There's limits to how much money can be lent, and those limits become even more increasingly difficult if economies start to decelerate substantially because of structural issues or because of some kind of economic shock. And growingly, we've seen quite a few economic shocks in the past 20 years, whether it's the 1997 Asian financial crisis, we had the dot-com bubble, we had the 2008 financial crisis, and we've had the financial crisis associated with COVID-19. And it appears that we're having an increased number of crises that I think are going to create more challenges in terms of a more outward oriented foreign policy that does do a lot of significant funding for these kinds of projects.
And how about the other challenge which you mentioned? I have a question about it, the degree of assertive behavior on behalf of China, of course. And we have seen that, yes, there is definitely a change in how China behaves to the different countries in this region. I just wonder, well, do you think that this will change, that this assertive behavior will actually increase or decrease as we go forward?
So I think it's really important for us to distinguish how some countries view China as an assertive country and other countries don't. And I've mentioned this before in some of our discussions, but if you look at the Afrobarometer, which is a big survey of African countries and how they view China very favorably. Frankly, they view China second to the United States in terms of the kinds of political and economic systems they would like to develop. They view China's Belt Road Initiative in many African states as largely positive, and they have strong bilateral relations. And if you go to other countries like Nepal or Cambodia or Laos, they have generally favorable views of China and their aid, not to mention Russia. So I think that we really need to be cautious when we say, that there's assertive behavior is universally recognized as problematic in when it comes to China, and that there's some regions of the world that look at Chinese behavior and Chinese aid as not assertive. Rather, they view it as a real alternative to past imperial behavior, past colonial behavior, and a kind of an antidote or a way to get rid of the yoke of colonialism that Western countries put on many emerging countries in the past. But in terms of assertive behavior within this region, I think really the potential sparks or the potential hotspots really are increased gray zone tactics against the Japanese, in particular in and around the Senkaku Islands. Taiwan, of course, I've mentioned many times, but Taiwan is a real critical area to be thinking about. The South China Sea is also a critical area to be thinking about. And less so, I guess, support for North Korea, although I think that's also a hot spot that many countries are worried about. Those three areas, the East China Sea, the Taiwan Straits, and the South China Sea, really have the potential to create and spark a regional crisis, whether it is a kinetic crisis or otherwise, that really, I think, could disrupt both the Philip Initiative and the Belt Road Initiative. And I don't think China wants to do that, but we're in a period where nationalism is pushing decisions by leaders in directions that I don't think are necessarily positive.
Good evening, Maya. Good evening.
Hi, Chao Ping.
Hi, Steve. Good evening.
Good to hear from you.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. From my understanding, today's topic is about the comparison between Japan's FOIP vision and China's BRI. Am I correct?
I was talking about comparing them rather than specifically focusing on the areas of cooperation, but I think that's an important area we can talk about.
Okay, thank you very much. And I also want to express my appreciation that you shared the article with me. I have read your article, and basically I agree with you. You have argued that Japan's FOIP vision is actually not an anti-China strategy, especially from geopolitical perspective. Basically, I agree with your opinion. I think it's true that the geopolitical dimension is not very important in Japan's Indo-Pacific vision or strategy, because this is not the strong point of Japan. I mean, geopolitical competition with China is not the strength of Japan, but of the United States. And from my perspective, and this is also widely accepted by Chinese people, that Japan is not a country with complete sovereignty, because Japan is reliant on the protection of the United States, and the U.S. is the security provider of Japan. So the geopolitical dimension of the Indo-Pacific strategy is actually the responsibility of the U.S., not Japan. From my understanding, the Indo-Pacific strategy is a coordinated initiative between U.S. and its allies, and Japan is one part of that strategy. But geopolitics is not the focus of Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy. Probably economic dimension is much more important than the geopolitical dimension in terms of Japan's FOIP vision. This is my understanding. I think U.S. will focus on geopolitical dimension, but Japan should share some burden of the U.S., especially in the economic dimension. So this is my understanding. And I also want to talk about the perception of China for Japan's FOIP vision. So I think you are right that Japan has no intention to pursue an anti-China geopolitical strategy in terms of FOIP. I agree with your analysis, but on the other hand, the perception of China is very different. So this is understandable. Similarly to China's BRI. Okay, for China, from China's perspective, BRI is a pure economic cooperation initiative. China has no any geopolitical intention or ambition in terms of BRI, but the perception of BRI is very different from China's narrative. Very different. For many countries, BRI is one geopolitical project of China or geopolitical power projection of China, especially for the United States. China is trying to challenge the hegemony of the U.S. through BRI projects in Eurasia continent and the Indo-Pacific region. So, I mean, this is really a contradiction for BRI. And for Japan's Indo-Pacific vision, the situation is similar. For Japan, okay, FOIP is about rule of law, it's about transparency, it's about economic cooperation. But from Chinese perspective, FOIP is interpreted as one anti-China geopolitical strategy. This is really very, very important. So I think the situation is quite complicated. Maybe Japan has no intention to pursue an anti-China geopolitical strategy, but the perception of China is very different. So how can Japan convince China that FOIP is not an anti-China strategy? I think this is a task of Japan. Of course, for China, they have also the challenge that they have to convince the international community. Okay, BRI is really an economic cooperation initiative. So this is my observation of the situation. So I'm eager to hear from you. What's your analysis of the situation? Thanks.
Thanks very much, Chao Ting. How can we convince the Chinese that all these initiatives are not anti-Chinese? I just don't know. Whether you read Wang Jixi from Peking University or other scholars. What's the famous scholar from Tsinghua University? I'm trying to remember. It'll come back to me. But if you read these scholars, they're pretty honest that China is really insecure about its regime and insecure about its governance and insecure about its global reputation. And as a result, I think that it often sees everything through the lens of regime security and China containment. Even the Cold War narrative, I don't think the Cold War narrative started in the U.S. or in other countries. Actually, I think it's been propagated by China for at least 2 decades. When it was raising the concerns about the continuation of the Japan-U.S. alliance following the end of the Cold War. So I'm not sure that actually Japan has any agency in terms of convincing the Chinese that this is not an anti-Chinese initiative, because I think most of the insecurities that come from China are really related to its domestic contradictions. And for the Chinese, what can they do to convince the world that the BRI doesn't have geopolitical intentions? I think it goes down to the obvious contradictions that exist between what is said and what is done. So I don't really buy the debt trap diplomacy that has caught on in some circles. For example, Sri Lanka fell into debt trap diplomacy. But when you speak to Sri Lankan scholars, they'll say no. It's actually our government that screwed up. It wasn't the Chinese that created the conditions. The Chinese came in after our government screwed up. So I think that some of the narratives about the BRI are really manufactured. But other narratives, and I've heard this even from Chinese scholars, everything that works is a BRI and everything that doesn't work is not the BRI. So I think there's a lot of internal contradictions within the Chinese context, which are quite obvious to the outside world, but in the domestic context of China, it's really challenging to, say, listen Xi Jinping, these things aren't working, right? It's the political system is not open to that kind of check and balances. And again, that goes back to rule of law, and it goes back to transparency, and it goes back to a system that I think has really concentrated decision making and around an individual rather than around institutions and around a legal framework that's based on an independent judicial system. But I'd be interested to hear your views about that as well.
Yes, thanks. Actually, I have read a lot of literature of Chinese scholars. I think Indo-Pacific strategy is really very, very important foreign policy for China. And China has a very strong sense of insecurity. And they are afraid of the encirclement or containment strategy coordinated by US and Japan. So there are a lot of very intensive discussion about Indo-Pacific strategy. So any actions, any measures of Indo-Pacific strategy could be interpreted by Chinese scholars and decision makers as hostile. This is really possible. Even it's economic project. Okay, so because from Chinese perspective, strategy is comprehensive. It's not only about security, geopolitics. It's also about economics. From Chinese perspective, the strategy is always comprehensive. For example, I can give you one example. Why has China launched the BRI? One of the most important motivations is that the sense of security since the TPP, since the TPP. Okay, in the eyes of Chinese decision makers, TPP is an economic initiative of containing China. Probably it can be perceived as the economic NATO in Asia, economic NATO. So that's why China has failed. Okay, China has been threatened by the US and Japan. That's why China have to make a response of TPP. That's why China has launched the BRI. This is an interpretation of BRI's motivations. So I think if Japan and the US don't want to escalate the tension with China, I think they have to be very careful to consider Indo-Pacific strategy, even economic part, economic of the Indo-Pacific strategy. This is also very sensitive. From have to pay attention to the BRI. I think they have understood that the response of other countries, the perception of other great powers of BRI is quite negative. And I think they have downplayed the importance of BRI. And I'm not sure if you have paid attention to the reality that China has not organized the third BRI forum. Okay, the first BRI forum took place in 2017, and the second took place in 2019. The third should take place in 2021, but nothing has happened. I think because of the corona pandemic, it's impossible to have an offline forum, but an online forum is possible, but nothing has happened. This means Chinese leadership has realized the response to BRI is probably not so positive as they have imagined.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I just want to dig down into your brainchild thing, because you said Chinese scholars, and when I think about, I never think of China as a monolith in terms of the scholars or policymakers. I know privately that many Chinese have lots of different views about Japan and the United States and FOIC, but publicly the voice is very, very monolithic. Where the Japanese context and the U.S. context and Canadian context, we have people that totally think the free and open Indo-Pacific is just like you said, part of the U.S. containment strategy against China, and that really it's not about economic security. It's really about containing China. We have that group of people, and they're very loud, and they write, and they talk about it publicly. And then we have, I guess, people that on the other end of the spectrum, writing that it's economic security. It can't be about containment. So I'm curious, where is that space in China? Because you said the Chinese scholars think one way, but my experience is that it's probably not one way. There's probably a lot of different ways. But in public, there seems to be one voice. But in private, there's different voices.
Yeah, I agree. think in front of the public, they have to follow the guideline of the official strategy or official policy. But privately, the discussion is also very diverse, and there are many voices which are very careful about Belt and Road Initiative. And I think they have realized that there are a lot of critics against BRI. So now they are trying to change the BRI. They are trying to the implementation approach. For example, they pay attention to the environmental protection much more than before.
Yeah.
Xi Jinping has declared, okay, China will not finance core projects anymore. So this is a suggestion, okay.
So I think that's really interesting for us to be thinking about. And if we're trying to create, some crosswalks for cooperation between the two, then we have to create that space for the heterogeneity of views about China in Japan through the FOEP, and the heterogeneity of views about Japan and FOEP in China to talk and find the crosswalks where they can cooperate and build trust, right? And of course, in this particular environment, we don't have a lot of that. I see Lynn has her hand up.
Yes. Yes, Professor, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Lynn.
Professor, could you share more about, in your articles, could you share more about the critics of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific region as anti-China containment? I mean that where do the critics see the containment elements in FOIP?
Well, I think that the using these expressions such as rule of law, a rules-based system, the critics of these kinds of rhetoric are saying, well, who made the rules, and should we not include China in the rule making process? And I think that argument is very strong in China. So the current international system that really dominates international politics was made when China was very, very weak, and it didn't have a strong say in the international system in terms of how economics work, in terms of the construction of international institutions. So the critics of FOEP that, when they're talking about this free and open idea, they're saying, no, well, free and open and rules-based, whose rules is really important. And should we focus on rules, or should we focus on inclusion of many different kinds of political systems and understandings of rules? So that's one way how they are criticizing, I think, the free and open Indo-Pacific vision. The second is, again, they use a lot of the same rhetoric that I think Chao Ting was saying that many scholars feel about the free and open Indo-Pacific, that Japan is a junior partner of the United States, and that it doesn't have autonomy in terms of security or foreign policy, and that it's really a tool of the United States. So I think that is primarily the basis for their criticisms about FOIP. I personally don't think they're accurate based on what we've seen over the past 10 or 15 years in terms of Japan really being the leader about the Indo-Pacific. But that's, I think, in a nutshell, how they are criticizing the free and open Indo-Pacific vision.
Yeah. So when I read the article, I think that's when you talk about the economic aspect analysis, I think that is convincing. But to my understanding, that the anti-China containment may come from the argument that many still view security and economic separately. I mean, for example, there are many arguments that I read that they state that from since the second administration of Abe administration, so Japan's foreign policies shifted from economic focus to security focus. So when they look security and economic separately, so then I think that for Japan's foreign, many countries, maybe in terms of economic aspect, they will be willing to promote this vision of Japan. However, when in terms of security, many countries may feel that it aims to containment of China. So it is my basic understanding about this.
Yeah, I think that in that case, and this goes back to what Chao Ting said, is that they have to be better spokespeople for their initiatives, and they have to demonstrate through action if these initiatives are security focused or economically security focused. And I think that both countries could probably do a lot better in terms of how they are communicating what these initiatives are.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. That was a great comment. Thank you. Chao Ting, what do you think about that?
Thank you, Steve. I'm not sure, but from my personal perspective, I believe the competition between FOIP and the BRI is really good. So I think inside China, there is no opposition. There is no official opposition party. So there is no checks and balance inside of China. But the competition from US, Japan, and other countries, for example, FOIP, is playing a role of checks and balance for China. We have discussed the improvement of BRI. For example, now China pays more attention to transparency, environmental protection, and civil society. I think this is a result of the critics of Western countries. So China has learned from these critics. That's why the competition from the Western countries and Japan is really beneficial for China. So on the other hand, I think the competition from Chinese side against U.S. hegemony is also very good, very positive for the world. For example, during the Cold War era, I think the former Soviet Union is a peer superpower of the U.S. And they are playing the role of checks and balance for each other. I think U.S. has invaded Iraq in 2003. This is really a disaster for the U.S. and the world. Why has U.S. made such a mistake? Because they have no checks and balance in the international stage. Because that time Soviet Union has collapsed. So U.S. is the only superpower, so they can do everything they want to do, and there is no any country, no any great power which is in position to check the U.S. But now China is increasingly a peer competitor of the U.S. And I think this is good for our world. So I think competition in the international stage is really very important for all of us. And now China and the U.S. are competing, especially through BRI and free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. If they can control and manage the competition to avoid military conflict, if they can focus on economic and cultural competition level, this is nothing bad. But if they fail to avoid military conflict, so this is really bad. I think both sides have the intention to avoid a military conflict. I think the Biden administration has made it very clear now the U.S. is having a strategic competition, extreme geopolitical competition with China, but they want to prevent the competition from relating to military conflict. This is really necessary. I think from Chinese side, they don't want to have any direct military confrontation or conflict with the US and Japan. This is the same. So China wants to focus on economic competition from their perspective. Okay, BRI is indeed an economic cooperation project. So, and now you have emphasized that the Indo-Pacific strategy of Japan is also an economic initiative. I think economic competition is not bad; it's acceptable. It's really positive for all of us, especially for the developing countries. This means that they have more choice now. In the past, probably they have only one choice from Western countries and Japan, but now China is another. China is an alternative choice. So this is really good for developing countries.
Yeah, I think in many ways it is. I guess the question is from my point of view, and it goes back to how I distinguish the difference between the FOIP and BRI, is one is this idea of a non-binding, non-legalist approach to providing loans. And my concern about this is that it can be used to prop up weak regimes or poor governance structures. And that means that the development process is actually not comprehensive. I think we've seen the best kind of development comes with hand in hand with good governance practices, transparency, and rule of law. And I think that is an area that China has filled through the BRI, and that is something that probably is not probably not good for those countries in the long term. It might be good for those regimes in the short term. So it's something to think about when we're thinking about the competition between the two systems or three systems, and what kind of competition are we actually seeing. And I think that they're interacting with each other. And I'd like to really emphasize that. It's the reactiveness and interactiveness of these two initiatives that will play out probably over the decades to come. And we'll probably see both initiatives become more refined and more integrated moving forward.
I think that a lot of people hope that the initiatives will become more integrated and more refined. But shouting to your point, and I'm an ordinary person who has been living in the region for 20 years now, and certainly you said that from a Chinese perspective, economic competition is good, and then other types of competition are not acceptable. But at the same time, during the past several years, we have seen, China invest a lot into its military power, and so it's certainly something which is worrying, and a lot of the countries in the region are definitely very apprehensive about this. So if China thinks that economic competition is good but military is not, why is then China militarizing? It's probably a very basic question, but still, a lot of people wonder about it.
Yeah, yes. I agree. I think the military competition is very dangerous because military conflict or military competition is one part of the geopolitics, and the geopolitical competition is always zero sum. That's why it's very dangerous. But the economic competition is different. For economic competition, all parties can win. Economic competition is a positive sum game, but geopolitical competition is a zero sum game. I think the geopolitical competition between China and the U.S., probably Japan, is really very dangerous. But I have seen the situation is really out of the control. From Chinese perspective, the Indo-Pacific strategy of the U.S., including Quad, including AUKUS, they are military security airlines against China. And I have done some personal research. I do believe the Indo-Pacific strategy of the U.S. is mainly a geopolitical strategy. On June 1st, 2019, the Indo-Pacific strategy of the U.S. was published by Department of Defense of U.S. Okay, Department of Defense, not Department of Commerce. So it's mainly a geopolitical strategy. Probably Japan focus on economic part, but we have analyzed from Chinese perspective, Japan is only one junior partner of the U.S., and Japan is trying to share the economic burden of the U.S. So I think the negative perception is mutual. From Chinese perspective, they are facing existential security threat from the U.S. because U.S. is actually much stronger than China from military perspective. So China is forced to enhance its military strength, including nuclear arsenals. So I think the situation is really dangerous, and it's very difficult for all the stakeholders. I think the trust must be established mutually. So this is difficult. I think this is a moment which is testing the wisdom of the decision makers. I have not seen any signal that the decision makers of China and the U.S. have the wisdom to avoid geopolitical competition. I have not seen any signal. So I'm really worried. I'm really worrying about the situation.
Yeah, Ting makes some really interesting points, and I think when you're thinking about Chinese investments in its military, and it's been significant. It's about 10% for every year for the past 20 years, so it's a big amount. And I think last year it was $200 billion or $206 billion in investments in its military. Still, that's not even 1/3 of the United States. But I think we need to drill down into where that money is being spent for China. And I think you might be surprised, but about half of that is for domestic security. Yes, the Chinese government is more worried about its domestic environment than the outside environment. Second, a lot of that spending is for modernization and for wages of its military. So in terms of the real expansion, it's not as big big as it might think. So I think it's really important for you to take a granular look of where that military spending, defense spending is going in the Chinese context. But at any rate, it's there, and it raises real concerns for neighbors. But I think it's really based on insecurity. And if you guys are interested in this, there's a couple essays by some very prominent Chinese scholars in the Foreign Affairs magazine just this past summer. And one of the essays is by Wang Jiji from Peking University, and the second one is by I'm just trying to remember the name.
You mean Yan Xuetong?
Yeah, Yang Shaitong, that's right. And they wrote really, quite convincingly about China's worries about the United States regime insecurity. They feel that their regime is not accepted by the United States or the international community. That the United States is bent on dividing China and keeping China down. And their examples are talking about it in the context of how China sees it being attacked over the decades. Whether it's Hong Kong or Tibet or the Xinjiang, or even the recent case of Ping Shuai, the tennis star. Is this about beating up China, or is this about this woman that really has brought up these issues of sexual harassment? So these two scholars, if you do have time, I encourage you to buy the issue. I think it's July, August. It really gives you some good insight in terms of how prominent Chinese scholars are writing about this issue. But the key for you, the take home, is they view the competition as existential for the government and for the party. Where I think the competition for how China or the United States views the competition with China is about influence and about perhaps the United States becoming less powerful, and other countries in this region, their view about the geopolitical competition is a little bit different. They understand that if the United States continues to dominate the system, will have preferential treatment and to be able to make more independent, strategically autonomous decisions vis-a-vis issues within the region. But they have real strong concerns about if China dominates the regional system. They understand the economics will be good, but they also understand that they will have to be deferential to Beijing's preferences on issues. And that could be everything from Taiwan to Hong Kong to human rights to criticism to not talking about Winnie the Pooh and Xi Jinping in the same sentence. So it has significant repercussions, and I think, again, they're understanding the geopolitical competition differently. But if you think about from this regime security versus diluting influence in the international system, that's a good starting point to understand why China is, I think, militarizing the region. What do you think, Chao Ting?
I think you are right. You are right. The regime survival is the highest priority of Chinese Communist Party. That's the number one task of them. That's why they have spent more money on domestic security than military budget. Okay, so because regime survival is the most urgent issue, and then now China is facing a lot of difficulties domestically. For example, the economic development is slowing down. You have analyzed it's true. I think China is facing a huge challenge of its zero tolerance COVID-19 strategy.
Absolutely.
And under such circumstance, the strategic competition with U.S. and Japan is really very, very bad for Chinese leadership. That's why I think they perceive the competition with U.S. as an existential threat. I think they have really very, very strong sense of insecurity. So that's why they are very sensitive for any strategic initiative of the U.S., especially for the Indo-Pacific strategy. I think the consensus of Chinese scholars and decision makers and the ordinary people is that the U.S. is using Indo-Pacific strategy to contain China from ocean, from ocean. Because so this has made Chinese people reminiscent of its history. So for the Chinese people and the Chinese decision maker, the wider consensus is that China has experienced the century of humiliation, right? So before from 1840 to 1949, the Western powers and Japan have invaded China from southeast coast, and Russia has invaded China from north and the west. And now the northern border with Russia is quite secure, safe. But now the southeast coast is facing same challenge as the century of humiliation, because the Indo-Pacific strategy is an alliance of maritime powers, sea powers. Okay, U.S., Japan, Australia, India, all of them are sea powers. So the Chinese leadership has the feeling that they are facing similar situation as a century of humiliation. So that's why they perceive Indo-Pacific strategy very negatively, very, very negatively. So, but on the other hand, I understand. So the BRI strategy is also perceived as an aggressive strategy of pursuing hegemony in Indo-Pacific and Eurasia. So this perception of threat is mutual. Okay, so from the American perspective, China is trying to challenge the rules-based international order, which is established and dominated by the U.S. But from the Chinese perspective, okay, the U.S. is trying to contain China. They want to stop Chinese economic development, not only economically but also ideologically and geopolitically. And the evidence is the Indo-Pacific strategy. So a lot of articles have analyzed the Indo-Pacific strategy from many different angles. So I think the perception is really very negative, and I don't know how they can improve the situation. There is no any signal, so they want to improve the situation. I mean, for both China and the U.S.
Yeah, I agree, and I think Japan is trying to articulate it, but really, I think that the insecurity really comes from within, and it's about, ultimately China is a revolutionary regime. It came through power through violence. It came through power by overthrowing a previous system and putting in its own system, and it continues to struggle for now 8 decades. So it's very difficult to remove that insecurity identity. I see Han on the line. Han, do you have a question or comment or?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question from Mr. Charlton. So I can't understand that, and Chinese leader seems to believe that, like, competition with the United States is going to threaten is regional security. But at the same time, I cannot help but observe that some of the Chinese moves are not really wise. I just say a bit too early on. So I want to tell I want to refer to the BRI and then the Made in China 2025. Those, even though I understand that those initiatives bring a lot of economic benefits for China, but at the same time they stand the risk of being interpreted by the United States as a side of China, like ready to challenge America at the Asia-Pacific, and right after the Trump administration zero its attention on the Made in China 2025, and the Chinese media, state media, and newspapers stopped referring to it for a while. So what do you think why China decide to push down some of these initiatives that early on? I mean, they can just continue to slowly and discreetly accumulate power and influence, and just waiting for the United States to continue to be distracted by a lot of domestic and international issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Is your question for me?
Yeah. It's for you, Mr. Charlton.
Okay. Thank you for your question. Yeah, as I have mentioned, from Chinese perspective, BRI is actually a defensive project, not an aggressive strategy. BRI has emerged in 2013, right? So in 2013, Xi Jinping has made 2 speeches respectively in Kazakhstan and Indonesia. Why has he made that speech in 2013? Because they have the perception that TPP is an initiative of the US and Japan to contain China's economic development. That time, TPP was quite a significant economic strategy. For some scholars, TPP is perceived as economic NATO in Asia, and the target is China from China's perspective. So China has to make a response to TPP, but China wants to avoid direct confrontation with US and Japan. So last time I have argued this is China's strategic culture. They want to avoid direct conflict or confrontation, especially military confrontation. This has long history, but people have different opinion. I agree, but as one Chinese, I do believe Chinese approach is always indirect rather than direct confrontation. So I think Chinese leadership wants to avoid a direct confrontation with the U.S. That's why they have the idea of marching westward. So Professor Nagi has mentioned Professor Wang Jisi, the professor at the Peking University. He has written one article in 2012, which is widely perceived as the origin of BRI. So Professor Wang Jisi has argued China should march westwards in the Eurasia continent because this is a huge continent, okay, and there is no strong presence of the U.S. and Japan, and there are many poor developing countries. They want to have foreign investment, okay, foreign capital, foreign technologies. So this is a huge opportunity for China to respond to TPP. That's why Xi Jinping has declared the BRI in 2013, and the focus is actually Eurasia continent and some developing countries in Southeast Asia. So from China's perspective, this is a defensive project, but the perception and the response of the other countries is really different. I think it's beyond the expectation, the forecast of Chinese leadership. So many countries believe BRI is China's aggressive, ambitious geopolitical expansion. So this is really beyond their expectation. From my perspective, this is a mistake of Chinese leadership. They can launch BRI project. This is no problem. But the state, the government should not play a strong role. But now the Chinese state is coordinating, organizing the state-owned enterprise to launch BRI projects around the world. From my perspective, this is really a huge mistake. They should encourage the private enterprise to make business development. This is much better, and there will be no such strong critics or critics against China because Chinese government is now coordinating BRI, so this can inspire a lot of critics, and this can inspire the feeling that China is trying to expand. Okay, so I think they have to change their approach. This is really, really important if they want to make BRI successful. I think now they are learning from that. They are trying to change their approach. As I have mentioned, there is the third BRI forum, no third, and they are trying to downplay the importance of BRI as one strategy. And from my understanding, now they are trying to push a lot of small and beautiful projects rather than huge infrastructure projects. So they are talking about small and beautiful projects. So this is my observation. Thanks.
I just want to add to Chao Ting's comment because I think, he mentioned and stressed, and I agree with him, that the state-owned enterprises are becoming more and more involved in the BRI projects. And this is very much related to the fact that I think the state and the party has become much more involved in the Chinese economy over the past 10 years. And this is related to social control. It's related to the view that the strengthening of what we call Leninist Marxist forms of government, where the party is, deeply inculcated into all organizations within society. That includes BRI projects. And once you do that, now these BRI projects are tied to what the party does, and what the party does, of course, there's many issues, whether it's, what's happened in Hong Kong, or the bellicose rhetoric towards Taiwan, or what's happened in Xinjiang. All of this now gets tied indirectly to the BRI projects, whether it's right or wrong. And this is going to create, I think, a big challenge for the BRI moving forward. And it goes back to my point about, what is the direction of the Chinese economy and how this will affect the BRI. And right now, the direction is the government is placing more and more control on different aspects of the Chinese economy, including the BRI. And this may create challenges in terms of its sustainability moving forward.
Yes. Good afternoon. Good evening. I used to be MA student studying what is democracy is all about. And I could really understand the frustration Chinese people or CCP has been having, because that's the frustration I had when I was doing my MA in 1999 to 2000 in UK. And actually, I've discussed with a professor who happened to be a professor of the Russian politics and society about the democracy itself. And what he was facing in Russia, whenever he went there to discuss with the scholars about the democracies, he was also asked the same question from the scholar about the democracy, and he couldn't make them sense whatsoever. They couldn't make understand about his professor's definition to their definition. And partly because I think the definition is broad, and everybody has got a different definitions, and the international society, led by USA or European countries, made their own rules based on their own belief, which is different from Asian, for instance. So that I think that is the big issue I could understand from the Chinese point of view, and also the person who my brother was deeply involved with the business with the Chinese people, and the business was about to start just before the COVID-19 came. So all I can say is that all I want is just put aside of the political thing or military thing. We need the business as normal is going is something I want to say. That's my final comment. I'm sorry to disturb you. The final closing point of Maya was making.
Thanks, Tomoko. I have lots to talk about on that, but maybe we can do that offline if you want to talk about the difference between how the Chinese understand democracy and, let's say, the United States. But I encourage you, if you're interested in this, to look at the initial first generation Communist Party leaders like Deng Xiaoping. They spent time in France, and they studied democracy from the viewpoint of French democracy, which put a focus on equality, fraternity, and liberty. And if you look at the understandings of development and democracy in China, it's very much based on economic equality as a precursor to political equality, where in the case of the United States and other Western countries, they put a premium on political equality before economic equality. But that's a whole other discussion.
Thank you very much again, Stephen. Thank you everybody who came up to speak with us, Lin and Chao-Ting, Han and Tomoko. So have a great day or a great night, and thank you very much again. Thank you, Stephen. This was Japan Expert Insights on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make every day count. See you.